The first whispers began in the kitchens, as most scandals do. Servants spoke in half-breathed sentences, their hands busy peeling fruit or polishing silver, while their eyes darted toward the marble staircases above. A shadow had fallen over the Palacio de Congor household, though no one dared name it aloud. It began, they said, with the Marquise herself. Proud, devout, widow of a colonial judge, and mother to 3 daughters whose beauty and dowries were already subjects of Lima's endless gossip. The Marquise ran her household with precision sharpened by grief, and beneath her rigid control lay the one secret she thought she had mastered, the human heart's unpredictable revolt. Domingo was brought to the house in 1801, purchased at auction after the death of his previous owner. A man of striking bearing, he carried the quiet dignity of someone who had long since understood the futility of resistance. His hands, broad and calloused, spoke of strength, yet his eyes betrayed neither defiance nor submission. The Marquise noticed this at once. He was assigned to the stables, then to the gardens, and finally, inevitably, to the household itself. He worked silently, efficiently, and over time became indispensable. At first, no one could say when it began. The shift in the air between mistress and servant, the invisible thread that drew her gaze when he entered a room. Lima's high society, with its gilded churches and fragile reputations, was a world built on appearances. But behind closed doors, human frailty thrived in silence. The Marquise, who had once prided herself on restraint, began visiting the gardens at dusk. There she would find Domingo pruning roses, his shirt damp with sweat, his breath steady. Their conversations were brief, almost polite, but something unspoken pulsed beneath them. It was not love, at least not yet, but something more dangerous: recognition. By the winter of 1802, the servants had learned to avoid the gardens after dark. Doors were locked, corridors emptied, and in the silence of the great house, a new rhythm took hold. The Marquise's eldest daughter, Adriana, began noticing her mother's absences. The younger sisters, Isabella and Sofia, whispered among themselves, suspecting an affair with a visiting nobleman. None imagined that the lover's skin was the color of mahogany, or that he slept in quarters once reserved for animals. It could have remained a secret, buried beneath the hypocrisy of colonial decorum, had it not been for an accident. One stormy night, Adriana, searching for her mother, entered the blue room. There she saw them, Domingo and the Marquise, locked in an embrace that made words unnecessary. The shock froze her where she stood, the image searing itself into her memory. Her mother's gasp, Domingo's startled turn, and the awful silence that followed. Adriana fled without a sound. The next morning, the Marquise appeared at breakfast pale but composed. Adriana avoided her eyes. No one spoke of what had happened, but something irreversible had been set in motion. Guilt metastasized into defiance. The Marquise, sensing that concealment was now impossible, continued her secret meetings, as if daring the world to condemn her. But Lima was not a forgiving city. In 1803, when the first signs of her pregnancy appeared, discretion was no longer possible. The household entered a state of controlled panic. Dr. Figueroa, a trusted family physician, was summoned under pretext of illness. He examined her, then left without a word, his silence purchased with a heavy purse. The servants were ordered to say nothing. Curtains were drawn. Visitors were turned away. But secrets in houses like these do not stay buried. A maid dismissed for insolence carried the story to another household, and within weeks, half of Lima knew that the Marquise Deager, widow of noble blood, was carrying a child conceived outside wedlock. What no one yet knew was that she was not the only one. Adriana, who had been restless since that night in the blue room, had begun to visit Domingo herself. Perhaps it was anger, perhaps curiosity, or perhaps the strange magnetism of forbidden power. Whatever the cause, she sought him in the same garden where her mother once stood, and what began as confrontation dissolved into something darker. Isabella followed months later, drawn by jealousy and confusion, by the same intoxicating aura of rebellion. Sofia, the youngest, quiet and impressionable, became the final victim of that entangled web. By the summer of that year, all 4 women of the house carried the same secret within them. 4 pregnancies, 1 source. The Marquise realized too late the enormity of what had unfolded under her roof. Her authority disintegrated. Servants whispered. Priests avoided her summons. And her daughters, bound by shame and silence, looked to her for salvation she could not provide. It was Father Calderon, the family's confessor, who first spoke aloud what no one dared to admit. He was a man of deep faith but limited imagination, unprepared for the reality presented before him. When the Marquise summoned him, she expected absolution. What she received was condemnation tempered by disbelief. He begged her to send Domingo away, to make restitution, to confess and retreat from public life. But she refused. "If God sees fit to punish me," she said, "he will do so through my own blood." In the weeks that followed, the household became a prison. Windows were shuttered, visitors turned away, the women confined to their rooms. The Marquise's once proud servants now performed their duties in fearful silence. Outside, Lima's social circles buzzed with speculation. Illness, madness, divine punishment, but no one suspected the full truth. Then came the night Domingo disappeared. He was last seen in the courtyard, summoned to the Marquise's chambers after midnight. 2 days later, his quarters were empty, his few possessions gone. The official story, whispered by the priest and repeated by the servants, was that he had been sent to work on an estate near the coast. But those who had known him knew he would never leave without farewell. The Marquise offered no explanation, only a brittle silence that dared anyone to ask. Rumors multiplied. Some said he had been sold again, others that he'd fled into the mountains. But one maid claimed she'd heard muffled voices that night, men's voices, the clatter of boots, and the distant sound of oars on water. By the time the infants were born in secret months later, the Marquise's hair had turned completely white. The deliveries took place in the sealed rooms of the 3rd floor, attended only by a midwife bribed into silence. The children were taken away immediately, each to a different household under cover of charity. Not one bore their mother's name. The Marquise told her daughters that this was mercy, that their lives depended on forgetting. But none of them ever truly did. Adriana wept through her confinement. Isabella withdrew into herself. Sophia nearly died in childbirth. Father Calderon, torn between duty and horror, drafted documents recording the true events and sealed them in the church archives, accessible only to direct descendants after the deaths of all involved. It was acknowledgement without confession, truth preserved but hidden. In the official record, nothing unusual occurred in the Palacio de Kingar household in 1803. But those who lived through it carried the evidence in their bodies and their nightmares. When Carlos Mendesbal arrived years later, seeking news of his father Domingo, he found only whispers and contradictions. He was a man shaped by silence, half-educated, cautious, but determined to know. The Marquise received him with forced politeness, claiming ignorance of his father's whereabouts. Yet Father Calderon, unable to bear his complicity, offered hints that led Carlos to the truth. Through bribes and persistence, Carlos traced 2 men once employed by the household. When enough gold loosened their tongues, they confessed. Domingo had been taken by boat into Lima's bay under cover of darkness. He was alive when the chains were fastened. Alive when he was lowered into the water. Alive when the waves closed above him. Carlos returned to the mansion with eyes hollowed by grief. In the blue room, he confronted the Marquise and her daughters. His words cut through the air like blades. "You murdered my father," he said. "Not by your own hands but through cowardice and convenience." The Marquise, trembling but unbroken, replied, "We ordered removal, not death." "You ordered erasure," Carlos answered. "You bought silence with blood." When he left, he promised to protect the children from the truth, but not their mothers. "You will live," he said, "with the knowledge that somewhere beneath this bay, a man you destroyed rests in darkness because you valued your name more than his life." After his departure, the house fell silent. Adriana entered a convent, Isabella declined into nervous ruin, and the Marquise, though she lived longest, carried her guilt like a rosary, turning each memory between her fingers until death finally took her. The documents remained sealed in the church archives for 70 years, When they were finally rediscovered by a scholar in 1872, he read them in horror and resealed them again. Too much time had passed. The guilty were dead. The innocent had lived whole lives built upon lies. To reveal the truth now, he reasoned, would serve only to spread pain further. So the story was buried once more, beneath Lima's shifting sands of memory, where the sea still whispers against the shore, and where, in the depths of the bay, the bones of a servant still keep their silence. Years passed, but the echoes of that night in 1803 never fully faded. Though the Marquise Deager's household resumed its rituals of civility, morning mass, formal dinners, polite visits, the air within the mansion remained heavy, as though its walls remembered more than they should. The great rooms were scrubbed clean, the servants replaced, the curtains reopened to sunlight. Yet the scent of secrecy lingered, like the ghost of perfume on a dead woman's shawl. Adriana's departure to the convent came quietly, almost mercifully. At dawn one morning, a carriage without insignia arrived at the servants' gate. She wore plain black, a thin veil drawn across her face. No one embraced her. Even her mother could not bring herself to watch her go. The driver, hired from Cusco, took her wordlessly into the mountains, where her name would be exchanged for a new one, her past for silence. In letters written years later, she spoke of sleepless nights and the tolling of bells that marked not devotion, but penance. Each sound, she wrote to Father Calderon, reminds me that I once brought life into the world and was made to give it away as if it were a crime. In Lima, Isabella and Sophia remained. The Marquise clung to them with desperate possessiveness, as though keeping her daughters near might contain the rot spreading through her conscience. Isabella grew pale and thin, her once steady hands now trembling at the sound of unexpected knocks. She could not stand the sight of the sea. Whenever conversation turned to ships or tides, she would excuse herself, retreating to her room, where she checked the locks 3 times before sleep. Sophia, youngest and most fragile, seemed to drift through days, as if detached from reality. She seldom spoke, but when she did, her words unsettled the household. "He still watches," she once said, staring toward the bay. "He knows what we did." Father Calderon visited often, though his presence no longer brought comfort. The confessions he heard from the women of that house had hollowed him out. He prayed not for their absolution, but for the strength to continue hearing them. Each visit left him older. He began to doubt the framework of redemption itself. How could confession cleanse a crime that had been premeditated by cowardice and hidden beneath wealth? He saw the Marquise less as a penitent soul and more as an example of the Church's failure to confront its own complicity in protecting the powerful. By 1806, whispers about the Palacio de Kingar family had faded from Lima's gossip. Society had found new scandals, political intrigue, colonial unrest, illicit affairs among lesser nobles, but beneath the calm surface, the household's curse persisted, a slow spiritual decay that time could not disguise. The Marquise attended charity galas, donated to orphanages, and sponsored hospitals for the poor. She was praised in public sermons for her benevolence. Only she knew these acts were not mercy, but attempts to purchase peace from a God she no longer trusted to forgive her. In 1809, she received an unexpected visitor, Carlos Mendes Ball, older now, his hair streaked with gray, his face hardened by grief. He had not returned to Lima since the confrontation years before, but now he stood once again at her door. The servants hesitated to admit him. When he entered the study, the Marquise rose slowly, clutching the armrest of her chair, as though steadying herself against a blow. "I've kept my word," he said. "The children live well. They know nothing." The Marquise nodded, unable to meet his eyes. "Then perhaps God will show mercy to us both." "There is no mercy in silence," Carlos replied. "Only postponement." He placed a sealed letter on her desk. "For when you die," he said, "it contains the truth. I will ensure it reaches the archives, so your descendants may one day know what blood they carry." The Marquise looked at him then, really looked at him, and saw Domingo's features reflected in his son's face. "You have your father's eyes," she whispered. "He never hated me, even at the end. I saw it in him." Then he was kinder than you deserved, Carlos said quietly, and left her without another word. After his departure, the Marquise took to her bed for several days, claiming illness. Father Calderon attended her, and later wrote, in his private notes, that he believed she had begun to see visions. Domingo at the foot of her bed, Adriana's child crying in the night, chains clinking in the rhythm of the waves. Whether these were dreams or the workings of a guilty mind, none could say. When news came in 1811 of Adriana's death in the convent, the Marquise locked herself in her chamber for 3 days. On the 4th, she summoned Isabella and Sofia. Your sister has found peace, she told them. Perhaps we will too someday. Isabella said nothing, only stared at her mother's pale hands, and thought how they looked like bones already. Sofia wept softly, asking whether their sins had followed Adriana into the afterlife. The Marquise answered, sins do not follow us, child. We carry them, and when we die, we leave them behind to haunt the living. The years that followed were marked by decline. Isabella's health deteriorated. She suffered fainting spells and fevers that no physician could explain. Servants claimed she spoke to unseen visitors at night. Once, a maid overheard her murmuring, "You shouldn't have gone into the water, Domingo. We could have hidden you better." She died in her sleep in 1815, her face serene in a way that unsettled even those who had pitied her. Sofia survived her mother by only 4 years. Though outwardly composed, she was plagued by nightmares. In them, she said, she saw a dark figure standing on the bay's surface, chains trailing behind him like seaweed. "He never speaks," she told Father Calderon. "He just watches me until I wake." When the Marquise died in 1819, her funeral was an elaborate affair, attended by Lima's most influential families. No one mentioned the scandal. The priest who led the service spoke of her charity, her devotion, her fortitude. Father Calderon, standing in the back of the cathedral, said nothing. He knew the eulogies were lies, but he lacked the courage to correct them. When her coffin was lowered into the family crypt, he felt not closure, but relief. The living ghosts of that house had at last joined the dead. Afterward, Calderon tried to write the full truth, hoping that confession through history might redeem what confession through faith could not. But the task consumed him. He could not decide whether he was chronicling a tragedy or participating in another cover-up. The words refused to balance judgment with mercy. One night, in despair, he burned the pages. Watching the flames consume the testimony, he murmured, "Let the sea keep its dead." He died the following year, leaving only the sealed documents, the same ones he had promised to restrict from public view, until every principal in the affair was gone. For decades afterward, the Palacio de Kingar name persisted, diminished but not destroyed. Their descendants lived respectable lives, ignorant of the foundation upon which their privilege rested. The mansion passed from family to family, its rooms repainted, its purpose repurposed. By the 1850s it had been divided into apartments. The blue room where Domingo once stood was now a sitting room, where families drank coffee and argued over rent. The floors still creaked in the same places. Children whispered that at night they could hear chains dragging across the tiles, though their parents dismissed it as superstition. Then, in 1872, a young ecclesiastical researcher named Mateo Ruiz discovered the sealed packet among forgotten ledgers. He had been cataloging donations from the early 19th century when he noticed the label, "Sensitive Records, Palacio de Kingar Household, 1803-1820, not to be opened without ecclesiastical authorization." Curiosity overcame him. He broke the seal. The confession unfolded across several pages in Father Calderon's hand. Dates, names, testimonies, and a single haunting sentence at the end. They drowned him because truth threatened comfort. Ruiz read through the night, trembling as he pieced together the hidden history of Lima's most prominent family. By dawn, he understood that publishing it would destroy reputations still revered by the church and the state. He resealed the packet, wrote a note in the archive catalog, and placed it back on the shelf. "To be opened only by direct descendants or ecclesiastical order," he wrote. Then he left the church, walked to the edge of Lima's bay, and stared into the water. The sea was calm that morning, untroubled, almost innocent. But as he watched, Ruiz imagined something stirring beneath the surface. Chains rusted by time, bones long surrendered to the silt, the quiet persistence of guilt that no generation had dared to face. He crossed himself, whispered a prayer for the nameless dead, and walked away. The truth slept once more, buried not by earth but by indifference, which has always been history's most reliable accomplice. And so the story of the servant who shattered Lima remained untold, hidden behind sealed papers, erased from sermons, replaced by the polite amnesia of the powerful. Only the sea remembered, and the sea, unlike men, does not forgive. In the decades following the Marquise's death, Lima remade itself again and again. The city expanded outward, replacing its decaying colonial bones with new facades, painted white, framed in iron, pretending at modernity. Yet beneath the cobblestones and plaster, the old families still ruled, their wealth inherited from sugar, from the mines, from those whose names never appeared in records. The Palacio Deager line remained among them, thinned by marriage and migration but never extinguished. By 1872, when Mateo Ruiz discovered the sealed papers in the cathedral archive, few remembered the name at all. Those who did spoke of the family as patrons of art, as benefactors of Lima's hospitals. None recalled the scandal, nor the servant whose drowning had once threatened to upend their world. History, it seemed, had succeeded in its favorite task, forgetting. But the past never disappears, it only rearranges itself into new forms of silence. The following year, Ruiz returned to the archive. He had tried, for nearly 12 months, to forget what he had read. The confession of Father Calderón haunted his dreams, each line written in the hand of a man who had spent a lifetime excusing evil in the name of faith. Ruiz saw his own reflection in that failure. He too worked for the church. He too had been taught to preserve order above truth. He began to study the document in secret. In his personal notes, later found among his belongings, he wrote, "If the sins of one generation remain unspoken, they become the inheritance of the next. The King Ger's descendants live among us. They must be told." Through discreet inquiries at the civil registry, Ruiz traced the surviving branch of the family to a modest house near the district of Barranco. There, he found a widow named Ana Teresa de Ingor, age 26, who lived with her infant daughter and an elderly aunt. She knew nothing of her lineage beyond a few proud phrases. "Our ancestors were patrons of the cathedral, and our blood comes from noble stock." Ruiz did not tell her otherwise. Instead, he asked if she would be willing to hear a history that concerned her name. Ana Teresa agreed, curious rather than afraid. They met in her parlor, a narrow room smelling faintly of salt and damp plaster. Ruiz brought a copy of the sealed confession, made carefully by hand. As he read aloud, Ana Teresa's expression changed from polite interest to horror. She rose only once, to close the window against the sound of waves. When he finished, she said nothing for a long time. Then, softly, "So our fortune was built on a murder?" Ruiz nodded, and on silence. She looked down at her sleeping daughter, whose small hand curled against her arm. "You should burn it," she said. "Let the past stay buried. It cannot help the living." Ruiz left her house unsettled. That night, he dreamed of chains again, of something dragging itself across the ocean floor, seeking breath. Weeks later, news spread through Lima that Ana Teresa had taken ill. Her aunt reported strange symptoms, sudden chills, visions of water filling the room, whispers heard at night. The physicians declared it nervous exhaustion brought on by grief. Her husband had died the previous year. But Ruiz knew better. He visited her bedside once, in early November. Her face was pale, her lips cracked from fever, and yet she smiled when she saw him. "You shouldn't have told me," she said. "He's awake again." "Who?" Ruiz asked. "The one they drowned. He follows me." He tried to calm her, telling her it was fever speaking. But she gripped his hand and whispered, "The bay knows what we did. It remembers everything we bury." Ana Teresa died 2 nights later. Her daughter survived, though neighbors swore they heard crying from the sea the same evening, a child's voice carried across the wind. After the funeral, Ruiz could no longer pray. He left the church and took a position as a clerk in the National Library, Cataloging colonial manuscripts, he continued his private research into the Palacio de Kengar family, gathering fragments from estate inventories, letters and baptismal ledgers. What emerged was less a genealogy than a pattern, a repetition of loss, of children dying before their mothers, of mothers retreating into convents or madness. It was as though every generation was paying interest on a debt no one alive had incurred. In 1880, Ruiz compiled his findings into a single volume, marked, "For the Record of Private Conscience." He never published it. The manuscript was found after his death, tucked inside a drawer alongside a rosary and a small piece of corroded chain. The document passed quietly into the library's restricted collection, where it remained unread for nearly a century. The 20th century brought new ghosts to Lima: revolutions, earthquakes, disappearances. But the story of the Kengar house lingered at the edges of memory, surfacing only in rumor. Tenants who lived in the subdivided mansion swore that the walls wept during storms. One reported waking to the sound of someone hammering wood in the courtyard, steady, rhythmic blows, like a carpenter at work. Yet the shed had been torn down generations ago. In 1954, the building was condemned and demolished. The workers who dismantled the structure uncovered, beneath a layer of lime and rubble, a set of chains fused by rust. Their foreman dismissed them as remnants of the colonial slave quarters, but one man, an older laborer from Callao, refused to continue after seeing them. He claimed the metal was still wet with seawater, though it had not rained in days. That man died a month later, drowned in the bay during a fishing accident. His companions said he had been standing at the bow when he suddenly leaned forward, as if recognizing someone in the water. Then he was gone. By the 1970s, the land where the mansion had stood was replaced by a modest apartment block. Residents sometimes complained of leaks that could not be traced, of doors swelling with moisture, even in dry seasons. Children in the building told stories of a dark figure standing at the edge of their beds, dripping seawater, his face indistinct. Their parents forbade them to speak of it. In 1999, a graduate student from San Marcos University named Luis Calderon, no known relation to Father Calderon, discovered the Ruiz manuscript in the library's archives. Its spine was cracked, its ink faded, but its contents survived. Intrigued, he transcribed the text and published an academic paper titled The Hidden Scandal of Lima, 1803. The piece was meant for a small audience of historians, but it spread beyond academia, shared and reshared until it reached the internet, where facts blur easily into legend. People debated whether the account was genuine. Some claimed the story was invention. Others swore their grandparents had told them of a noble house, cursed by the drowning of an innocent man. A few said the curse still clung to the bay, that divers who ventured too deep sometimes found bones chained to stone, their faces turned upward in the current. Luis Calderon dismissed the rumors, but privately he confessed to friends that after reading the manuscript, he began to dream of water seeping under his door, of footsteps pacing outside his window. When asked if he feared the ghost, he replied, "No. I fear the silence that made him." 3 months later, Luis disappeared. His apartment was found empty, save for the printed copy of his paper on the desk. The last line, underlined in pencil, read, "The sea keeps its own archives." And so the story endures, not in history books, but in the whispers of the city itself, in Lima's oldest quarter, where the air still smells faintly of salt and memory. People speak of the servant who shattered the house of a Marquise, whose bones lie somewhere beneath the bay. Some say his spirit has forgiven nothing. Others say he doesn't need to, because the truth, once drowned, learns to breathe underwater. The transcript that follows was not part of any known record until 2011, when an anonymous donor left a sealed envelope at the Historical Archive of Lima. There was no name or return address, only a note. This was found beneath the floorboards of an apartment in Barranco. You will know where it belongs. Inside was a faded journal bound in blue cloth. The first page bore the initials LC and a date, October 3, 1999. If the handwriting comparison is accurate, the author was Luis Calderon, the same researcher who vanished that same month. His notes form the last known document connected to the Kengar case. Oh, October 3, 1999, I cannot sleep. Every sound in this building feels rehearsed: the ticking pipes, the faucet's slow drip, the sighing of the walls. They speak in water. I keep hearing a faint rhythm, a tapping from beneath the floor, as if someone were nailing boards shut. The landlord claims there's no basement, but there must be. The plans show one, though the door was sealed when the apartments were renovated in the 1950s. I've found the outline of it behind the kitchen wall, plastered over. The paint there never dries. 3 nights ago, I dreamed I was walking through the bay, the water so clear I could see the sand ripple under my feet. Then I realized I was breathing. Someone stood behind me hammering. When I turned, he was holding a wooden crucifix, unfinished, splintered at the edges. His eyes were open, but full of silt. When I woke, my sheets were damp, though the window was closed. October 5, I reread Ruse's manuscript today, searching for what I might have missed. There's a passage I can't explain, a line that seems to appear and vanish between readings. Hay was not alone when they drowned him. The ink looks newer, darker, almost as if it were written recently. Could Ruiz have returned to his notes after sealing them away? Or has the manuscript itself changed? I've begun hearing voices through the pipes. Whispers, mostly in Spanish, sometimes Quechua. My recordings capture nothing but static. Still, I know I'm not imagining them. They repeat one word: Divue el velo. Return it. I don't know what is. October 8, the neighbors complain about the leak again. I told them my pipes were fine, but last night water began seeping through the floorboards, cold and briny. It smelled of the sea, not rust. I mopped it up twice, but by morning it returned, gathering near the wall where the basement door would be. I keep Ruse's rosary on my desk. The metal of the crucifix has turned green, as though it's been submerged. I found something else, a fragment of chain caught between the boards. Heavy, pitted with corrosion. I don't know how it came to be there. October 11, I spoke to a priest today, Father Ortega, at San Francisco. He dismissed it all as obsession. When I mentioned the Kigar case, he grew quiet and said, "There are some names we don't repeat." Before I left, he added, almost in a whisper, "You found the servant's chain, didn't you?" I didn't answer. He told me to throw it into the sea before it remembers who it belongs to. October 12, the tapping has grown louder. It echoes through the nights, slow and deliberate, as though the boards themselves are breathing. When I press my ear to the wall, I hear water moving. I think there's someone behind it. The remaining pages of Calderon's journal are damaged by moisture. The ink bleeds, forming black rivers across the paper. Only fragments are legible, knocking from below. Like a carpenter saw him in the reflection. Behind me, over my shoulder, who his mouth was full of salt. Cannot tell if I am reading or remembering. The final entry, barely legible, reads, "He is not angry, he is waiting." When the apartment was inspected after Calderon's disappearance, authorities found no sign of violence. The walls and floors, however, were saturated with moisture, and the basement, once thought sealed, had been partially exposed. Beneath the floorboards lay a cavity filled with standing water, about a meter deep. At the bottom was a corroded chain. Tests showed the water contained high salinity, consistent with seawater. The building stood nearly 5 kilometers from the coast. What follows is an extract from an internal report written by archivist Dr. Mariana Quisp, dated 2012, who oversaw the examination of Calderon's recovered notes. There is reason to believe that the apartment's foundation was built upon the original grounds of the Kingar estate. Geological surveys confirm that underground runoff channels connect directly to the old aqueducts leading toward the bay. When I entered the space myself, I heard what I can only describe as the sound of distant hammering, muted but rhythmic, like construction beneath the waterline. I brought back samples for analysis. The sediment contains traces of bone and mahogany dust. No contemporary woodworker would use such material. Mahogany was restricted by the late 19th century. What troubles me most, however, is the residue on the chain fragment. Under magnification, the corrosion appears layered, centuries of oxidation interrupted by a fresh, thin film of salt. as though it had recently been submerged again. There is no plausible source for that. Dr. Quisp requested that the file be transferred to the National Repository. Her supervisor denied the request and sealed the case, citing lack of evidence. She resigned shortly after. A year later, she sent a letter to a colleague in Madrid. It was never delivered. The envelope was found in her office after she vanished without notice. The message read, "I think the servant was never buried. The sea took him, yes, but the house kept a part of him. It's as if each person who opens the record inherits the remainder. The chain isn't a relic, it's a key. He doesn't seek vengeance. He seeks completion. Do not open any door that smells of salt." The apartment block in Barranco remains occupied. Tenants still report humidity that no repair can cure. At night, some hear hammering from the floor below, where no apartment exists. Maintenance crews refuse to enter after dark. And on certain evenings, when the tide is high and the wind shifts inland, the building's lights flicker in unison, as though something deep beneath is drawing breath. Those who have read Calderon's notes say they begin to dream the same dreams: a man, standing in water up to his chest, eyes open, hands raised not in accusation but in offering, as if he means to give something back. No one can agree on what that offering is. But every witness remembers the sound, the hammer, 3 slow strikes, and the whisper that follows, "Return it." They said the matter had ended once the confession was sealed, but such endings rarely hold. Months passed before the first signs of disturbance began within the walls of the Deager estate. Servants complained of damp plaster that refused to dry, of faint hammering that came from rooms long abandoned. The family chaplain, who had remained on the property to manage the chapel records, described the sound as construction in reverse, as though invisible hands were unbuilding the house from within. No one admitted fear at first. The Marquise had died believing her legacy preserved by secrecy, and her remaining heirs treated the house as a necessary symbol rather than a home. They hosted small gatherings in the courtyard to maintain appearances, though the upper floors were now closed, allegedly for restoration. Behind the pretense of maintenance, the truth waited. In June of that year, Father Calderon completed the final draft of his sealed record. The document was written with measured precision. Neither confession nor accusation, simply the account of a priest who had witnessed the moral collapse of a family he had served. He placed it within the church's archives with a note, to be opened only by direct descendants, and only when silence ceases to serve the living. Those were his last recorded words regarding the affair. After his death, the key to the chest was lost, or perhaps deliberately hidden. Yet even locked truth exerts pressure. By 1811, small rumors began to spread through Lima's parish networks. Carpenters who worked in the house reported tools found rusted overnight, fresh timber marked with symbols no one recognized. One described a chain, like pattern burnt into the grain, each link forming the shape of an open eye. They dismissed it as mischief until a laborer drowned in the bay, weighted by his own apron cords. The coincidence was noted but never officially linked. The following year, the youngest surviving daughter, Isabella, fell into nervous illness. She complained of water running under her floors though the house sat far above the bay. Servants often found her standing in her chamber, barefoot, as if listening for something beneath the boards. She spoke occasionally of a man with salted hands, who stood by her mirror. Doctors prescribed laudanum and rest. She died 4 years later, still insisting the floor hummed. The Marquise outlived her daughter by 4 years, though age had reduced her to a ghost long before death completed the process. Visitors described her sitting in the study each afternoon as the sun crossed the window, her gaze fixed on the far corner where the walls met. She had ordered that no crucifix hang in that room. One servant who disobeyed claimed the cross fell repeatedly until she removed it. The Marquise said nothing, but afterward her will included a peculiar clause: the chamber wherein blue paint was used is to remain unoccupied for all generations. Decades passed. The estate survived revolution, shifting governments, and the slow decay of colonial wealth. By the time Peru claimed independence, the Deager name held only ceremonial significance. The mansion's upper floors had been converted into rented rooms, its chapel turned storehouse. Yet in 1872, during a minor renovation, workers uncovered a concealed space behind the chapel wall. Inside lay a set of documents, perfectly dry despite the damp environment. The papers bore the seal of Father Calderhon and the date 1803. The foreman who discovered them delivered the box to the archdiocese, where it was catalogued but not read. His statement recorded a faint odor of salt water emanating from the papers, as though they had been stored underwater. No immediate investigation followed. Bureaucracy buried the find once again, and the mansion returned to quiet disuse. Only in the following century would scholars reopen the file, drawn by curiosity about colonial domestic scandals. The historian most associated with this rediscovery was Professor Esteban Ruiz of the Universidad Nacional Mayor de San Marcos. Ruiz was meticulous, skeptical of superstition, and devoted to exposing the hidden mechanisms of aristocratic hypocrisy. He began his research in 2009, intending to publish a study on ecclesiastical complicity in social crimes. His private notes, later recovered from his apartment after his disappearance, suggest the project took an unexpected turn. Ruiz wrote of his first visit to the ruins of the Deager estate. The property, now divided into modest apartments, retained sections of the original foundation. Tenants reported inexplicable moisture and a persistent humming sound in the old stone corridors. Ruiz's initial skepticism softened after he witnessed condensation forming on walls untouched by plumbing or rainfall. The air, he noted, tasted faintly of iron and the sea. He located the sealed papers in the diocesan archive under the reference Archivo Paroquial 113 Ken G. The box was still intact, the wax seal unbroken. He photographed it for his notes, but before requesting permission to open it, he began cross-referencing local birth registries. What he found disturbed him enough to alter his tone entirely. His later notebooks, scrawled in uneven handwriting, contain references to the duplication of lineages, a child with 2 official deaths, and a household where baptismal water was replaced by seawater. In one entry he describes a recurring dream, the sound of hammering echoing through the bay, as if someone were nailing boards beneath the waves. He began referring to this as the submerged workshop. When colleagues questioned him, he claimed the sound was real, transmitted through the city's drainage channels at night. Shortly after, he isolated himself in his apartment and stopped attending lectures. In February 2012, Ruiz recorded a short audio message on his laptop. It was discovered months later by police investigating his disappearance. The message lasted less than 2 minutes and contained only a few coherent sentences before dissolving into static. His final words were, "He is waiting." Official reports concluded that Ruiz drowned after falling into the bay during fieldwork, though no body was recovered. His laptop, found on his desk, showed signs of corrosion as if submerged briefly in salt water. The file labeled Cadana 5 of phenol was the last document accessed. Its contents were never publicly released, but excerpts circulated privately among his students. They describe a man who believed the past persisted not as memory, but as unfinished labor. That the dead continued shaping the living world, driven by unresolved intention. Ruiz wrote, "The servant is still building, not a coffin, a bridge." Those who read his words claimed strange consequences. One student, Ana Ciordenas, reported hearing rhythmic tapping from inside her apartment walls after transcribing the file. Another, who had assisted in digitizing the documents, drowned during a coastal storm the following year. The remaining members of the research group destroyed their copies, fearing contagion of a kind they couldn't define. May never have existed physically, it may instead symbolize the unbroken continuity between guilt and remembrance. Yet those who touched the story seemed marked by it, as though acknowledgement alone constituted inheritance. In recent years, restoration has begun on the old mansion. The project, funded by cultural grants, aims to convert the site into a museum of colonial domestic life. Workers continue to riff any truth lies within these accounts. It is that history resists burial. Each attempt to seal the record only amplifies what refuses to be silenced. The chain described in Ruiz's notes report problems with moisture, electrical malfunctions, and unexplained tremors, During an inspection last month, a team photographing the basement recorded faint metallic sounds that ceased when approached. One technician described it as a man working patiently, like a carpenter. The municipal report made no mention of these details. If this account has any conclusion, it is this: the chain remains unbroken, because every new observer becomes another link. The silence that once protected the powerful now sustains their victims' unfinished story. The servant's name, spoken after 2 centuries, carries more weight than all the titles that once commanded him. And still, at low tide, beneath the waves of Lima's bay, divers claim to hear hammering on metal far below the sand. The sound is steady, deliberate, never ceasing. The investigation into Ruiz's disappearance never truly ended, only faded as attention shifted elsewhere. The police labeled it an accident, though privately several officers admitted to discomfort. When entering his apartment, they reported a smell of ocean brine clinging to the walls, even though the building stood far inland. The neighbor below claimed that water leaked through her ceiling every night at precisely the same hour Ruiz had last been seen alive. She moved away within a month. When the university sealed his office, they discovered the wooden box mentioned in his notes, small enough to carry yet unnaturally heavy. No identifying marks were visible, except for a shallow groove running around its perimeter, suggesting it had once been bound by something metallic. Curators decided not to open it until legal custody could be determined. In the weeks that followed, 2 archivists assigned to its cataloging fell ill with pneumonia despite the dry season. The third reported hearing someone knocking softly from inside the box itself. She resigned the next day. No record exists of who finally broke the seal, but by 2013 the box's contents had been removed, catalogued, and placed in storage at the Museo Nacional. What remained was an unlabeled chain of 12 iron links fused into a twisted oval. Testing indicated the metal predated the 19th century, though traces of salt and organic residue made further analysis difficult. The curator who supervised the examination wrote privately to a colleague, "It is not rust that binds these links, it is time itself." That same year, the museum began to experience unexplained humidity in its colonial artifacts wing. Dehumidifiers failed, and water stains appeared on ceilings above exhibits unrelated to the chain. Visitors complained of the faint sound of dripping water that never matched any plumbing source. One night guard resigned, after claiming to see footprints forming on the tile floor, as if someone had walked through shallow surf. Despite this, the chain remained on display for 3 months. In August, a tourist captured a short video showing condensation forming rapidly across the glass case. As the lens fogged, the faint outline of a face appeared reflected in the surface. Indistinct, eyes open, lips slightly parted as if exhaling. The video spread briefly online before being removed, though archived copies survive. Sound engineers who enhanced the audio reported a low hum synchronized to the museum's air circulation system, a hum repeating in 4-beat rhythm: hammer, pause, hammer, pause. After public concern, the museum withdrew the exhibit and sealed it in basement storage. The official reason cited was preventive conservation. Unofficially, staff avoided the room altogether. A technician assigned to inspect environmental conditions noted in her log, "There is no water source nearby, yet the air feels alive." The events that followed blurred into a pattern Lima's local historians now refer to as La Cadena Viva, the living chain. Scholars attempting to trace the lineage of the Kingar family discovered missing baptismal entries, erased notations, and discrepancies in birth dates. In several parish records, inked-out names bled through with repeated washing, reappearing faintly as if refusing to vanish. Among them was always one recurring word: Domingo. By 2015, a small academic circle led by anthropologist Laura Gamara attempted to consolidate all surviving documentation into a comprehensive archive. She believed the curse, or haunting, if such a word applied, was an inherited trauma encoded in record-keeping itself. Gamara proposed that the repeated concealment of truth created a psychological loop, each act of censorship sustaining the original crime's memory. Her project was titled Cadena de Sangre, The Persistence of Guilt in Colonial Lima. The grant proposal was approved, though it warned against sensationalism. Yet Gamara's field notes soon revealed experiences that defied her own skepticism. While photographing the basement of the former Ingor mansion, she heard faint hammering from beneath the stone floor. She assumed it to be construction from neighboring buildings, until she realized the rhythm matched precisely the pulse pattern from Ruiz's recovered audio file. Her assistants urged her to leave, but she insisted on continuing the survey. That night, according to her audio diary, she dreamed of standing waist deep in seawater that filled the mansion hallways. In the dream, a man stood across from her holding a length of chain. His voice, though calm, carried through the water as clearly as speech through air. Each link is a choice. When she woke, her shoes were damp and flecked with salt. Gamara disappeared 3 weeks later. Authorities found her car abandoned near the cliffs above Calo Bay. Her last known action was sending an email to her research group containing a single line of text. "Hay is still building." From that point forward, the story shifted from academic curiosity to urban legend. Locals began calling the Kingur estate La Causa Qui Respira, the house that breathes. Residents described walls exhaling cold mist at night, the scent of seawater filling stairwells, and occasional faint knocks echoing through the plumbing. Contractors hired for structural repair often quit within days, complaining of nausea and the feeling of unseen observers. City officials planned demolition in 2017, but the project halted when surveyors reported the foundation resting upon a network of older tunnels previously undocumented. These subterranean passages extended toward the bay, lined with water channels and stone basins. Archaeologists suggested they had been used for colonial drainage, but measurements revealed irregular spacing. As though designed for something other than water, one of the engineers compared the pattern to a skeleton made of corridors. The government sealed the area, citing instability. Still, local fishermen claimed that on quiet nights, they could hear metallic sounds rising from beneath the waves, rhythmic and patient. Divers sent to investigate returned early, unnerved by sudden temperature drops and the impression of movement in the silt. One diver reported seeing what looked like human footprints leading away from the submerged ruins toward deeper water. His partner dismissed it as light distortion, but the video they recorded was later described as corrupted beyond restoration. By 2018, only fragments of documentation remained: Ruiz's audio, Gamara's notes, and the sealed church record from 1803. The surviving custodians met privately to decide whether to destroy the materials or release them publicly. Their minutes, written by an anonymous hand, capture the dilemma succinctly. Silence protects no one now, yet truth serves nothing either. What remains is duty. They chose preservation. The files were digitized, encrypted, and stored under restricted access. Soon after, the servers hosting the project began malfunctioning. Data logs filled with strings of repeated words, "Kdmkgedena," continuing until memory overflow. No source of the input was identified. By this time, the legend had absorbed itself into Lima's folklore. Children dared one another to whisper the servant's name into drains, or to knock 4 times on basement floors. Some claimed to see ripples form across walls, others to hear breathing from beneath stone. The rational explanation was groundwater pressure, yet even engineers began to hesitate before entering the old quarters at night. The last recorded account comes from a night watchman employed at the cultural restoration site in 2020. In his statement, he describes patrolling the upper gallery when he heard metal scraping along the walls. Assuming vandalism, he followed the sound down the stairwell toward the sealed basement door. There he found the chain lying across the threshold, each link glistening with moisture though the air was dry. When he touched it, he felt warmth and a slow pulse, like that of a living vein. Startled, he dropped it and fled the building. By morning, the chain had vanished. What remains certain is that every attempt to confine the story has failed. The boundary between record and haunting dissolves when the act of remembering itself becomes contamination. The servant's labor never ceased. It merely shifted medium, from wood and stone to ink, from ink to sound, from sound to code. Each retelling becomes another workshop, another set of hands continuing the work. Carlos's visits to the households where his half-siblings were raised became part of his life's quiet rhythm, a ritual of atonement that neither soothed nor resolved his guilt. He never told anyone his true connection to the children, not even in moments when affection threatened to break his restraint. The families that had adopted them regarded him as a distant benefactor, a man of mysterious generosity who seemed moved by causes he never explained. To them, he was a kind but haunted gentleman, his dark eyes betraying something unspoken, a sorrow that made even his smiles seem borrowed. In truth, he lived two lives: the visible one of a merchant and scholar respected in Lima's growing middle class, and the secret one bound to the ghost of his father, and the sins that had built his bloodline. At night, when the city quieted, he wrote in a private journal that he kept locked in a wooden box lined with linen. In its pages, he addressed Domingo, as if he could still hear, "They have all gone, father. The women who destroyed you found no peace in their years. But neither have I. Justice is a word I no longer understand. Perhaps what remains is only memory, and memory, I have learned, can punish more deeply than law." He returned often to the edge of Lemur's Bay, where fishermen still cast their nets from the same rocks that had swallowed Domingo's body decades earlier. Sometimes he stood there until dawn, imagining that beneath the surface, bones whispered like coral, retelling the story the living refused to speak. It was said by locals that the bay was cursed, that boats which lingered too long near its center sometimes drifted in circles, their oarsmen hearing voices beneath the waves. Carlo said nothing when he overheard such talk. He simply nodded, as if the sea itself were keeping vigil for what the land had buried. Years passed. Lima changed, the colonial order weakened, and whispers of revolution began to stir through Peru's cities. The old mansions that had once hosted Spanish nobility began to decay. The Palacio Deager estate, once a symbol of wealth and scandal, was no exception. By the 1830s it had already begun to crumble. Windows broke, gardens turned to wild growth, and the marble floors that had echoed with footsteps of the powerful grew dull with dust. Carlos visited it once more before leaving Lima for the last time. He stood in the blue room, now stripped of paintings, its walls faintly smelling of mold and salt air, and imagined the night his father had been taken from this place. He placed a small carved figure, one Domingo had once made for him as a child, on the mantel and left without looking back. He settled eventually in Arequipa, taking work as a tutor for a local family. Though he aged, his grief never softened. He became known as a man of discipline and integrity, but also of loneliness. Those who knew him well said he carried the air of someone who lived among ghosts. When he died in 1856, his personal effects were few: a journal, a faded portrait of a young woman believed to be Sophia, and a gold crucifix. Among his papers, no mention of the scandal appeared directly. Only cryptic reflections on truth, silence, and the price of survival. For decades afterward, the name Palacio Deager appeared only in old church ledgers and land records, forgotten by all but a few historians who cared to trace the tangled webs of Lima's aristocracy. Yet the documents Father Calderon had sealed in the church archives still waited, untouched, beneath the dust of time. Generations rose and fell. The descendants of those once bound by blood and secrecy lived ordinary lives, unaware of the ghosts shaping their history. It was not until the late 19th century that chance reopened the wound. A young cleric named Manuel Torres, tasked with reorganizing the church archives, stumbled upon a locked chest labeled Records, Sensitive 1803 to 1820. The key had long been lost, but the lock was fragile with age. Driven by curiosity, he pried it open. Inside lay a bundle of parchment sealed with wax bearing the mark of the old diocesan crest. The handwriting, still legible, carried Father Calderon's name. Torres began to read. What he found shook him deeply. The documents chronicled every event: the scandal, the pregnancies, the murder, the compromise that followed. Names were written plainly. So were the acts that had been concealed under euphemisms of removal and protection. He sat in silence for hours after finishing, his hands trembling, his heart heavy with the same moral question that had tormented Calderon decades before. Should the truth be told now that all involved were long dead? In the end, Torres resealed the documents. He added a note in the catalogue, marking the contents as restricted, to be opened only by direct descendants or ecclesiastical authority. He told no one of his discovery, though the knowledge haunted him until his own death years later. The documents returned to silence, and with them the possibility of public reckoning vanished once more. The past, it seemed, had chosen its own grave. Meanwhile, the city grew around the ruins of the old mansion. By the dawn of the 20th century, Lemoore had transformed into a dense urban district. The Palacios Deager estate, stripped of its grandeur, had been divided into small apartments rented by working families. Children played in courtyards that once hosted masked balls. Women hung laundry from balconies that had overlooked processions of noblemen. No one living there could have imagined the sins the walls had absorbed. Yet sometimes, tenants whispered that the house carried strange sounds. Footsteps in empty rooms, doors opening at night, the faint echo of a woman crying when the tide was high. Historians later debated whether the Palacio Deager scandal should have been exposed. Some argued that truth, no matter how painful, must emerge for justice to exist. Others believed silence spared the innocent, those descendants who had built lives upon the ruins of their ancestors' deception. But the silence persisted, woven so tightly into Lima's social fabric that by the time anyone might have spoken, the story had already dissolved into legend. In that legend, fragments remained: a noble family destroyed by its own hypocrisy, a slave whose dignity defied the order meant to erase him, and a son who carried the burden of knowing both sides of the world, master and victim, privilege and punishment. What justice could ever balance such contradictions? Perhaps none. Perhaps the truest justice lay not in courts or confessions, but in the quiet decay of names once spoken with reverence. By the mid-1900s, the bay that had once swallowed Domingo's body was ringed with docks and warehouses. Few remembered that beneath those waters lay the unmarked grave of a man whose life had shaken an empire's moral foundations. The tides, indifferent as ever, continued their rhythm, rising, falling, erasing footprints, consuming memory. The scandal's final echo lived only in the faintest rumor that somewhere in the archives of Lima's oldest church, a sealed chest still held a story too dangerous to tell. A few researchers claimed to have glimpsed its catalogue entry, though none admitted to opening it. Some said it no longer existed, lost in a fire that destroyed part of the building in 1923. Others insisted it survived, hidden beneath new walls and records, its truth waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to uncover it. But perhaps it was better this way. The world had moved on, the bloodlines had mingled, the hierarchies dissolved, the sins forgotten by all but the sea. What purpose could revelation serve now, when all it would accomplish was to remind the living of how far human cruelty can reach under the guise of order and respectability? And yet, sometimes, when storms rolled in from the Pacific and lightning illuminated the coast, old fishermen swore they saw a figure standing at the edge of the bay. A man in 19th century clothing, staring out at the water, as if searching for something long lost. They said he vanished when the waves struck the rocks, leaving behind only the sound of chains shifting beneath the tide. Whether ghost or memory, it didn't matter. Lima, in its restless sleep, still carried the echo of what had happened in 1803, the scandal that had begun in secret rooms and ended in silence. In the decades that followed, Lima continued to change, layer by layer, like a palimpsest of forgotten lives written one atop another. The old social order of the viceroyalty had long since dissolved, replaced first by the chaos of independence, and then by the uneven calm of a new republic. Yet the moral geography of the city remained marked by invisible scars, streets and buildings whose stones remembered what history chose to forget. The former Palacio Deager stood among them, its facade cracked, but still recognizable, its heavy doors now leading to narrow corridors crowded with families who cooked, laughed, argued, and prayed beneath ceilings that had once echoed with whispered crimes. No one living there knew the house's true story. To most, it was just another relic of colonial opulence, stripped of its former grandeur. But a few tenants spoke of strange occurrences, of mirrors clouding over without cause, of water dripping in rooms where no pipes ran, of a faint humming in the walls at night. Mothers warned children not to wander the upper floors after dark. They said a woman's shadow lingered near the windows, gazing out toward the bay, as though waiting for someone who never came back. In 1934, a university student named Rafael Menendez rented one of the small rooms on the second floor. He was studying history at the Universidad Nacional Mayor de San Marcos and had little money. The old mansion's low rent suited him, and the odd atmosphere didn't bother him. In fact, he found it strangely comforting. He liked to imagine the lives that had filled the house before his time. The laughter of servants in the kitchens, the heavy perfume of ladies in silk, the sound of hooves in the courtyard. The past, for Rafael, was not something distant. It was alive, breathing through walls and objects. One evening, while reviewing notes for a paper on colonial ecclesiastical archives, he came across a reference that stopped him cold. It was a brief footnote in a faded journal by a 19th-century cleric named Manuel Torres records concerning the Palacio Deager household, 1803-1820, sealed by order of ecclesiastical authority, to be opened only by direct descendants, or with express permission. The name struck him with a strange familiarity. Palacio Deager, the same name his grandmother had once mentioned in hushed tones when describing the old family house, in which her father had worked as a carpenter's apprentice. Rafael's curiosity deepened into obsession. Over the next few weeks, he scoured the university library for any mention of the Deager family. He found little: a few baptismal records, some land disputes, a reference to a Marquise who had donated to the church in the early 1800s. Nothing about scandal, nothing about disappearance. The silence in the record seemed deliberate, and the mention of sealed documents only fed his determination. He applied for permission to access the church archives, citing academic research. After weeks of waiting, he was granted entry, but not unrestricted access. The archivist, an elderly priest with watery eyes, led him to a dimly lit room filled with stacks of boxes and bound registers. "You may look at colonial correspondence," the priest said, "but certain collections remain closed. For the good of families, you understand?" Rafael nodded politely, though the phrase "for the good of families" lodged in his mind like a splinter. Families long dead, he thought, whose good did silence still serve? On his third visit, while cataloging parish registers, he noticed a heavy chest pushed beneath a table, half hidden by a tarpaulin. Its brass corners were green with age, and on its lid, barely visible beneath the dust, was a faint engraving: PD, 1803. His heart quickened. He brushed away the grime, revealing an old diocesan seal, cracked and faded. The lock was broken. Inside, wrapped in decayed linen, lay several bundles of parchment tied with ribbon. The topmost page bore the signature of Father Ignacio Calderon. The ink had browned, but the words were clear. Rafael began to read, and as he did, the air in the room seemed to grow heavier. The story unfolded in fragments: confessions, correspondence, accounts of meetings, and, most hauntingly, a letter written in a hand that trembled between remorse and self-justification. It spoke of a slave named Domingo, of the Marquise and her daughters, of pregnancies, payments, disappearances. The phrases felt impossible, obscene, yet they carried the ring of truth. The documents described events that could have destroyed the city's most powerful family, if anyone had ever dared make them public. By the time Rafael finished reading, dusk had fallen. The priest found him hours later, still seated at the table, staring at the last page as though it contained a curse. When asked what he had found, Rafael only said, "A history that wanted to stay buried." That night, back in his small rented room, he couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house sounded like footsteps in the hall. At one point, he rose and looked out toward the bay, visible through the cracked window shutters. The water glimmered faintly under the moonlight. He thought of the man named Domingo, drowned, forgotten, erased, and of the women who had tried to hide their guilt behind charity and prayer. He imagined their descendants walking the streets of Lima, unaware that the blood of both oppressor and victim ran in their veins. The next day, Rafael returned to the archives, intending to copy the documents, but the chest was gone. When he asked the archivist, the old man frowned. "There is no record of such a box," he said. "Perhaps you are mistaken." But Raphael knew what he had seen. Something, or someone, had removed the evidence overnight. In the weeks that followed, he tried to speak about it to his professors, but none believed him. Without proof, his claims sounded like fantasy. Gradually, he stopped mentioning it, yet the story would not leave him. He began to dream of the house, the same house in which he now lived, its corridors filling with seawater, its walls groaning as if the ocean itself sought to reclaim what it was owed. He wrote everything he remembered into a private notebook, trying to preserve the fragments before they slipped away. He titled it Testament of the Bay, but he never published it. When he died in 1948, the notebook was found among his belongings and placed with his personal papers in the university's archives. There it remained, unread, another secret folded into the silence. Years passed. New tenants came and went. The old mansion endured earthquakes and renovations, its original structure warped but unbroken. Children born in its rooms played where once noble women had hidden shame. Time had turned scandal into legend, legend into dust. And yet, on certain nights, when the wind from the Pacific carried the scent of salt through the broken shutters, the house seemed to remember. A door would open on its own, a mirror would cloud over. Somewhere faintly, a woman's voice would whisper a name that no one living recognized. Domingo. By the dawn of the 21st century, the building was condemned, scheduled for demolition to make way for a modern apartment complex. When the workmen began dismantling the old walls, they found, sealed within one of the interior columns, a small wooden box wrapped in oilcloth. Inside lay a silver medallion engraved with the initials DM, and a single folded page, yellowed with age. The writing was faded, but legible. "May those who inherit this land remember the price of silence." The foreman turned the note over in his hands, puzzled, then tossed it aside. By noon, the last of the blue room's walls had fallen. Dust rose into the air, mingling with sunlight. The house that had once been the heart of Lima's darkest scandal was gone. But history does not die with its buildings. Somewhere in the archives, perhaps still misfiled, perhaps deliberately hidden, the records of Father Calderon wait. Somewhere, too, lies Raphael's notebook. And somewhere beyond the reach of any archive, in the dark waters of the bay, bones rest beneath silt and coral, keeping their own kind of truth. The city above moves on unaware. Children laugh on the shore, couples walk the promenade. Lights shimmer on the surface of the sea that once swallowed guilt whole. Justice, perhaps, never came. But memory endures, in the walls that whisper, in the waves that never stop returning. The house was gone, but its echo persisted. Those who lived nearby claimed that, after demolition, strange things began to happen along the narrow block that bordered the sea. Dogs refused to pass the vacant lot after sunset. Construction workers, when breaking new ground for the apartment complex, said the soil beneath was damp and cold even when the rest of the city baked under the sun. One man said he struck something metallic under the foundations, but when he looked, there was nothing. Only water seeping through the dirt, carrying the scent of salt and rot. When the building was completed in 2007, the developers called it Residencial Mar del Sur, a bright, sterile name meant to erase whatever had existed before. Yet the residents soon discovered the place carried its own temperament. Light bulbs burst without reason. Plumbing failed repeatedly, always flooding from the same corner of the basement. The maintenance crew said the blueprints made no sense. There was a section beneath the north stairwell that led to solid concrete. They tried to drill through once, but the concrete was thicker than expected, like an old wall embedded inside a new one. The first tenant to report hearing the humming was a teacher named Valeria Soto. She lived alone on the third floor, in what had once stood roughly above the old blue room. She told the building superintendent that every night at 2 in the morning, she heard a sound like a saw against wood, faint but deliberate, accompanied by a low voice murmuring in a language she couldn't place. The superintendent told her it was the pipes. 2 weeks later, she moved out, leaving her belongings behind. Another tenant, a retired sailor, said that sometimes when he closed his eyes, He could hear waves breaking, not from the bay a mile away, but beneath the floorboards. His last night in the building, he woke to the sound of chains dragging slowly down the hallway. When he opened his door, the corridor was dry, but the air smelled of brine. He left before dawn, refusing to explain to anyone why. The residents who stayed learned to ignore the noises, the leaks, the sudden chills. The human mind adjusts to haunting when it has rent to pay. But the building seemed to grow restless over time. In 2012, a short circuit caused a fire in the basement. Firefighters arrived to find the flames strangely contained to one corner, where water poured from a cracked pipe and hissed against the heat. When they cleared the smoke, they saw words blackened onto the wall by "Sut fuel no say few." He did not leave. The phrase made its way into local gossip, into whispers among maintenance staff, into a brief mention in an online forum dedicated to Lima's urban legends. There, users argued whether it was vandalism or something else. One post linked the phrase to a supposed 19th century scandal involving a noblewoman and a servant drowned in the bay. But details were vague, the evidence circumstantial. Threads about the story tended to vanish overnight. In 2018, a graduate student researching colonial genealogy visited the building. Her name was Ana Salcido. She was tracing her maternal lineage through Lima's old families, and her work had led her to an unfamiliar name on an ancestral document. Deager. She didn't know why it caught her attention, only that it felt familiar. The address listed beside it was the same as Residencial Mar del Sur. When she arrived, she was struck by how new the building looked against the worn stone of the neighboring streets. It felt wrong, like something painted over a wound. She spoke with the caretaker, who allowed her to look around the lobby. As she walked through, she noticed the faint scent of damp salt, though it hadn't rained in weeks. In the basement, beneath the concrete stairs, she found the sealed section the workers had mentioned years before. The plaster was cracked, revealing an older layer of masonry behind it. Embedded in the surface was a rusted hinge, part of what must once have been a door. She pressed her hand against it. The concrete was cool and slightly vibrating, as though something beyond it moved at a rhythm older than the city itself. That night, she dreamed of water filling narrow corridors, of voices repeating a name she could not remember when she woke. The next day she returned with a small chisel, intending only to expose a fragment of what lay beneath. The first strike produced a dull echo, the second a thin trickle of water. By the third, the plaster gave way, revealing a dark cavity behind the wall. From within came the scent of brine and old wood. Inside the opening was a small recess, no larger than a chest. And in that recess lay a single object, a corroded medallion engraved with the letters DM. She held it up to the light, and in the dim glow she saw her own face reflected on the metal's surface. But not her eyes. They belonged to someone else, steady and calm, watching her. She dropped the medallion, stumbled back, and fled upstairs. That night, her neighbors reported hearing a woman scream, then the sound of water rushing through the stairwell. When they checked, everything was dry. The next morning, Ana was gone. Her apartment stood unlocked, her notebooks open on the table, pages soaked with seawater that had no discernible source. The official record listed her disappearance as unresolved. Her research materials were collected by the university, though much of her data was corrupted. Only one note remained legible. The bloodline never broke. It just changed its name. After her disappearance, Residencial Mar del Sur emptied quickly. Within a year, the building was abandoned, windows shattered by wind. The city cordoned it off for demolition, but the project stalled indefinitely. Bureaucracy, funding, ownership disputes. Each new attempt collapsed under strange circumstances. Some said the contractors refused to return after tools vanished overnight or engines failed without cause. Locals avoid the area now. At high tide, they say, you can hear the sea inside the building's hollow frame, as if the bay has learned to breathe through concrete. Those who have ventured close swear they can see the faint outline of a door beneath the stairwell, dripping with salt water that never dries. Behind it, they say, a rhythmic sound continues, hammering steady and patient, building something no one has yet seen. It is not vengeance that remains. It is persistence. The same persistence that once drove a Marquise to conceal her sin, that compelled a priest to seal his confession, that urged a scholar to dig where silence had settled. Each thought, each retelling, keeps the pattern alive, like breath feeding a slow, burning fire. The house is gone. The family is gone. The servant is gone. Yet the chain endures, its links now forged from memory, repetition, and the small acts of curiosity that reopen what should remain closed. At night, the tide rises higher along Lima's coast, swallowing more of the old city's edge. The water carries with it fragments, salt, bone, and voices too faint for language. Sometimes, on still evenings, those who listen carefully claim they can hear the whisper that began it all, faint as breath under water, nolo alvides. Do not forget, the demolition never came, paperwork expired, owners changed, the shell of Residencial Mar del Sur stood for years, windows blank, doors chained shut, its interior filled with nothing but dust, salt, and the low groan of wind. By 2022, the city had learned to look past it, a gray structure left off tourist maps, a mistake too expensive to correct. When the earthquakes came that winter, most buildings in the district trembled, cracked, and held. Only one collapsed. At dawn, the authorities found that Mar del Sur had folded inward, as if pulled from its own foundation, the concrete slabs stacked like ribs around a hollow core. No one was reported missing. The place had been abandoned for years. Yet rescue crews said they heard voices under the rubble, faint, rhythmic, like prayers spoken underwater. Days later, a volunteer uncovered a rusted metal box lodged beneath what had once been the stairwell. Inside were papers that had survived impossibly dry amid the ruin. Among them was a single page of lined notebook paper, written in a modern hand, signed A. Salcido. It read, "He's not angry. He's waiting. I think he's still building." Every story told about him is another beam, another wall. When the truth is finished, he'll finally have a place to rest. Below the handwriting, the ink had bled into the paper, forming a dark ring, as though touched by water from within. The papers were sent to the university's archives, catalogued without context among miscellaneous materials. Months later, the archivist in charge of processing the collection, an aging man named Ricardo, noticed that the documents dried out by morning, but were damp again by evening. He wrapped them in plastic, filed them, and tried not to think about it. But each night, when he locked the building, he felt something following him down the hall, the faint echo of footsteps pacing just behind. He began dreaming of a bay that was not a bay but a mirror, water perfectly still, reflecting a sky without stars. Beneath the surface, he could see shapes, not bodies, but silhouettes of people bent in work, hammering, carrying, assembling. Among them was a figure taller than the rest, his movements calm and deliberate. Each swing of his arm sent a pulse through the water, a vibration that lingered even after waking. Ricardo started recording the sounds he heard at night. The files were mostly silence, then faint tapping, then whispers that almost formed words. He played one back at low volume and thought he heard a sentence, broken but unmistakable: "La casa no termina." The house does not end. He never returned to the archives after that. His resignation letter was one line: "Please seal it again." The university kept the materials in cold storage. The box was labeled non-catalogued. Over time, its origin blurred, passed from one curator to another, reduced to inventory numbers. By 2030, no one remembered who had collected it, or why the folder smelled faintly of salt, and yet, copies began to circulate online. First a photograph of the medallion, then a scan of the page signed by Ana Salcido, then transcriptions of the supposed Calderon papers. The posts appeared on obscure history forums and disappeared within days. Those who read them described identical dreams afterward, of an unfinished structure rising from water, each beam marked by a name they couldn't recall upon waking. Some claimed that if you listened closely while reading, you could hear a low humming from your speakers, even when no audio played. Others said the text rearranged itself between sessions, the same way handwriting shifts when rewritten by someone else's hand. Eventually, the story escaped the academic corners and reached broader audiences. A short documentary appeared online. The servant who shattered the house of Lima. It mixed archival photographs with narration drawn from the recovered notes. The video went viral for a week before being deleted. Viewers reported that the final frame, an image of the bay at dusk, flickered for a second to show something beneath the surface, too fast to identify, like a face looking up through water. The channel that hosted it vanished soon after, but stories once spoken never truly disappear. They change form. They move through networks, through memory, through the slow, electric pulse of curiosity. Someone saves a copy. Someone else whispers the name. Someone begins to dig again, thinking they'll be the one to finish what others could not. And somewhere beneath Lima, where the tide presses against the stone foundations of the old city, something continues to build. Each time a retelling begins, the hammering resumes. Each repetition adds a room. Each listener becomes a wall. The structure grows, invisible yet expanding, fed by attention. If you're still reading this, you're already inside it. Listen carefully. The sound you think is your own heartbeat might not be. The house does not end. The tide does not rest. And the servant still works somewhere beneath the bay, shaping memory into stone.